Vernette walked in wearing the wrong dress for a family dinner. That was the first thing I noticed. Not her face, not the way she positioned herself slightly ahead of Trintia as they moved through the restaurant toward our table. The dress. Black, structured, pressed like she had steamed it that morning for something that mattered. Women wear dresses like that when they are going somewhere significant, not to a Tuesday night dinner with their daughter's in-laws. That dress was chosen. And the moment I saw it, I filed the information quietly in the place where I keep things. I am not ready to speak out loud yet. I am Laura Reed. I have lived in Atlanta for 31 years, raised one son in this city, and built a professional life on the currency that matters most in the rooms I move through. My word. I know how to read a room before the room knows it is being read. And what I read that Tuesday evening, from the moment Vernette Mabry walked through that restaurant door, was that I had not been invited to a dinner. I had been invited to a conclusion. If you are watching this right now, drop the time in the comments. I want to know what hour found you here. The food came. Conversation moved the way conversation moves when people are performing normalcy. Careful, surface level, nobody saying the thing that is already sitting in the middle of the table. Trintia asked about nothing that mattered. Desmond talked about the project the way he always talked about it around me lately. Briefly, with a particular kind of redirect that I had noticed but not named. Vernette smiled at everything and said very little. She was conserving herself. I understand that now. Then Trintia stood up. She didn't excuse herself. Didn't reach for her purse. She stood up from her seat with the deliberate movement of a woman executing something she had rehearsed, walked around the table to my side, and stopped directly beside me. Vernette was 2 steps behind her before I even processed that she had moved. They had done this before. Not this, specifically, but the formation. The way Vernette positioned herself as a wall behind her daughter told me this was a structure they had practiced in some version. Trintia looked down at me and said it. Calm. Measured. Each word placed like furniture. She told me she was pregnant. Told me the best gift I could give my grandchild was to disappear. Forever. She used that word. Forever. Standing at a restaurant table in Atlanta with her mother at her back and my son sitting 3 feet away, I turned to look at Desmond. He didn't hesitate, didn't look away, looked directly at me and said, "That's right, baby." 3 words, spoken with the ease of a man who had already made his peace with them long before tonight. I sat with that for 3 full seconds. Then I stood, reached for my napkin, folded it once, twice, placed it on the table with the kind of precision that only comes when every other part of you is working very hard to stay contained. Nobody at that table spoke. The couple 2 tables over had gone quiet. The silence had weight, and everyone in that room was sitting underneath it. I reached for my purse. That is when Vernette smiled. Not at Trintia, at me. Direct, deliberate. The smile of a woman who believed she had just watched something finish. I did not smile back. I did not speak. I felt something move through me that was not grief and was not rage. It was clarity. The specific, irreversible clarity that arrives when something you have suspected quietly for a long time finally decides to show you its face. I was not broken at that table. I picked up my purse, pushed back my chair, and walked out of that restaurant into the Atlanta night without a word to anyone. By the time I reached my car, I had already decided. I pulled out my phone, called one number. Vanessa picked up on the second ring. "I need you to listen," I said. "I'm leaving tonight." The skyline was still visible in my rearview mirror when I passed the last Atlanta exit on Interstate 20 westbound. I watched it shrink the way you watch something you built slowly disappear, not with panic, but with the particular ache of a woman who knows exactly what she is leaving behind and why she is leaving it anyway. My bag was in the back seat. One bag. I had packed it in 23 minutes without sitting down once. I was not crying. I was remembering. 12 years ago, I joined the Southwest Atlanta Community Development Board. Not because someone invited me, because I showed up to a public meeting about a corridor that was being quietly abandoned, and I was the only person in that room who asked the question nobody else asked. Not what the city planned to do, but what the community had already tried. That question got me a seat. The seat got me a board position. And the board position, on a Saturday morning in October, got me standing on a cracked sidewalk in work gloves next to a man named Caldwell Reese. He wasn't there as an investor that morning. He was there because that block mattered to him personally, a detail he never publicized, and I never repeated. We picked up trash side by side for 2 hours before we exchanged a single word beyond logistics. When we finally did talk, it was not about money or development or opportunity. It was about what a neighborhood looks like when the people who built it decide it is still worth fighting for. That conversation lasted 40 minutes. It laid the foundation for everything that followed. The relationship built across years after that. Phone calls, referrals, Reese watching how I moved through Atlanta's civic world with the patience of a man who understood that trust is not granted. It is observed. My word opened doors in those years. Not because I pushed them, but because I never gave my word carelessly. Every introduction I made held. Every project I touched, I stayed with. By the time Desmond came to me 3 years ago with the development concept, Caldwell Reese had spent a decade learning what my judgment was worth. He didn't need convincing. He needed confirmation. Desmond's concept was good. Mixed-use development in a Southwest Atlanta redevelopment zone, retail ground floor, residential above, planted in a corridor that needed exactly that kind of investment. I believed in the project. More than that, I believed in what it could do for the people on those blocks. I made the introduction to Reese personally, sat in that first meeting and watched Reese study my son the way he studied everyone, not with warmth, but with the specific patience of a man deciding whether what he was seeing was real. After that meeting, Reese called me privately. I have never told anyone what he said. He told me he would move forward on one condition, that I remained involved, not visibly. Not as a named partner in any public document, just present. My name on the underlying structure, my judgment accessible if the project hit a wall. He did not want Desmond's ambition. He wanted my foundation underneath it. I agreed. And I never told Desmond that call happened. I told myself it was protection, that I didn't want him carrying the weight of knowing his opportunity came with a condition attached to his mother's name. But driving west through Georgia, dark with my phone face down on the passenger seat, I understood something I had been avoiding for 3 years. That protection was also a blindness. I had shielded him so completely from the architecture of what I built that he grew up inside it without ever learning what held the ceiling up. He didn't betray me out of pure malice. He betrayed me out of ignorance. That distinction does not excuse him, but it clarifies him. And right now, clarity is the only thing I have that belongs entirely to me. The phone buzzed. I glanced down. Desmond. I watched it ring out. Then another call. Then another. I turned the screen face down and drove west into the dark. At 6:14 a.m., Desmond Reed was standing in front of a bathroom mirror in a suit that cost more than his first car, and he looked like a man who had already won. Behind him, through the open door, Trincia was on the phone with her mother, laughing about something. The sound of that laughter moved through the apartment, the way certainty moves through people who have never been wrong about anything important. Easy, unguarded, filling every room it touched. The deal closed at 10 a.m. This was the morning they had been building toward, and as far as every person in that apartment was concerned, the only thing left to do was show up and sign. Desmond had invited Trincia and Vernette to the closing himself. That detail matters. Nobody pushed for it. He wanted them there. He wanted the 2 women who had helped him see his situation clearly, as he understood it. sitting in that conference room when the documents were executed and the funds released, and everything became official and real. He wanted witnesses to what he had built, what he believed he had built largely through his own effort. Not because he thought his mother's introduction hadn't mattered, but because somewhere along the way he had convinced himself that introductions belonged to the beginning of stories, and that the hard work that followed belonged to him. The development attorney's office was on Peachtree Street, conference room reserved, Reese's representative flying in from Charlotte. By 7 a.m., Desmond's attorney had already sent written confirmation to all parties. Everyone required would be present at 10 a.m. Desmond read that email twice, filed it as settled. His phone showed 23 outgoing missed calls to his mother by that same hour. He set it face down on the bathroom counter. Told Trintia when she came in that his mother probably just needed space to process. Trintia nodded and said her mother had warned her Laura would find a way to make this moment about herself. Desmond accepted that framing without examination. He had already decided what he believed about his mother's silence. It was inconvenient. It was not alarming. More importantly, he believed the project had already reached the stage where the important decisions had been made. Whatever role Laura once played, he saw it now as something behind him rather than beneath him. Today was too important to let her absence become its own conversation. Vernette arrived at 8:30 wearing another considered outfit, structured jacket. Everything pressed. She moved through Desmond's apartment with the ease of a woman who had already taken ownership of a room before she entered it. She kissed Trintia's cheek, squeezed Desmond's arm, and said simply, "Today is the day." Nobody disagreed. They arrived at the Peachtree Street office at 9:05. The conference room was everything a closing room should be. Long table, leather chairs, water glasses already set. Desmond took the head position without being directed to it. Trintia and Vernette sat together on his right. His attorney arranged documents on the table with the efficient quiet of a man who had done this many times before. Fontaine arrived at 9:15. Earlier than expected. He was a composed man, 9 years with Reese's group, the kind of professional whose face gave very little away until he chose to give something. He shook hands around the table, accepted coffee, set his briefcase on the floor beside his chair without opening it. The room settled into the particular tension of people waiting for a process to begin. Then Fontaine looked across the table at Desmond and asked one question. "Is Ms. Reed joining us this morning?" He did not ask it the way a person asks about someone who might be running late. He asked it the way a person asks about a document they were specifically told would be present. The phrasing flat, the eyes steady, waiting for a confirmation, not an explanation. Desmond said she had been held up but would join shortly. Fontaine nodded once, slowly. Did not reach for his briefcase. Trintia glanced at Vernette. Vernette gave her a small, reassuring nod across the table. Everything was fine. Laura was irrelevant. This was still their morning. At 9:48, Fontaine excused himself to make a phone call. He was gone for 11 minutes. When he came back, he sat down, set both hands flat on the table, and said, "I need to share something with the room before we proceed." Reginald Fontaine did not clear his throat before he spoke. He did not apologize for what he was about to say or soften it with preliminary pleasantries. He reached into his briefcase, removed a single document, and placed it in the center of the table with the flat precision of a man who had delivered difficult information before and understood that the delivery itself was a form of respect. The room watched him do it. The document was not long, 4 pages. Fontaine opened it to page 3, turned it to face the table, and read the relevant section aloud in the even tone of someone reciting something that had always been true and was only now being heard for the first time. It was an escrow condition addendum, a private side letter attached to the original deal structure at formation, never filed publicly, never visible in any record search that relied on public documents alone. Laura Reed's name appeared twice in the section he read. Once as co-signatory required for the anchor parcel transfer. Once, as confirmed advisory participant whose acknowledgement was necessary before escrow could release. Fontaine set the document down. Did not elaborate. Let the language do what language does when it is precise and unambiguous. Desmond picked it up. Read it. Read it again. His face did not change in any way that another person might notice from across a table. But his right hand, which had been resting loosely on the arm of his chair, moved slowly to the tabletop and went flat. Still. The kind of stillness that is not calm, but is working very hard to appear that way. Trincia leaned forward and read it herself. Then she looked at her mother. Vernette's face in that moment was the most honest it had been all morning. Not frightened, not angry. Recalibrating. The expression of a woman who had built a structure on a set of facts and was now looking at a fact she had not included. Desmond told Fontaine the clause was procedural, that it could be amended. His voice was controlled, but the word procedural landed slightly too quickly, the word of a man reaching for footing. Fontaine told him it could not be amended without Reese's direct authorization. He explained that he had spoken with Reese's office that morning and had not received authorization to proceed without satisfaction of the condition. Until that authorization existed, escrow remained frozen, and the closing could not proceed. He said he was sorry for the inconvenience with the tone of a man who was professionally sorry and personally unmoved. Vernette spoke for the first time since Fontaine returned from his phone call. She asked how long that clause had been in the agreement. Her voice was measured, controlled. The voice of a woman who already suspected the answer and was asking anyway because the answer needed to be in the room. Fontaine told her the condition had been part of the transaction structure from the beginning, maintained in Reese's closing package and carried forward through every stage of the deal. The silence that followed was different from the silence before. The earlier silence had been anticipatory, the held breath of people waiting for something to begin. This silence was the sound of a room absorbing something it could not undo. Vernette had searched every public record available before advising Trincia. She had found the anchor parcel. She had found nothing that appeared to give Laura an active role in the current structure. No filings, no registrations, no public instruments indicating decision-making authority. She had concluded from that absence that Laura's role was ceremonial, historical at best. What she had not accounted for was the possibility that the most consequential structures are never the ones that announce themselves in public documents. Trincia turned to look at her mother, not with panic, with a question. The first genuinely unscripted question she had directed at Vernette in this entire process. Vernette did not meet her daughter's eyes. She looked at the document, reading it the way you read something when you are no longer looking for what you expect to find, but for what you missed. Desmond pushed back from the table, excused himself, walked into the hallway and called his mother. Voicemail, called again. Voicemail. He stood against the wall of that Peachtree Street building in his expensive suit and called a third time. No message, just silence on the line. And in that silence, slowly, something he had refused to consider all morning began to take shape. The hotel was on a street I had walked as a girl. Birmingham. I chose it the same way I had chosen everything in the last 12 hours. Quickly, precisely, without second-guessing. Nobody from Atlanta would look for me here first. That was the only qualification that mattered at 2:47 a.m. when I pulled off the interstate and found the first decent hotel with a vacancy sign still lit. I checked in under my name because I was not hiding. I was simply unavailable. There is a difference, and it matters. I slept 4 hours. Woke at 7 a.m. to a phone that had already been working without me. I made coffee from the machine on the dresser, carried it to the chair by the window, set it on the sill, and did not drink it. Outside, Birmingham was doing what Birmingham does on a Wednesday morning, moving, unhurried, indifferent to anything happening in a hotel room 1 floor up. I watched my phone on the table instead. Watched the screen light up and go dark, light up and go dark, with the rhythm of people who had expected this day to go differently. By noon, the count was at 47. By 3 p.m., it was at 71. Desmond, Trincia, a number I didn't recognize that called twice in a row. Desmond again. I watched each one arrive and expire without touching the phone, not because I felt nothing, because I felt everything and had not yet decided what to do with it. This was not satisfaction. I want to be precise about that because it matters. There was no part of me sitting in that Birmingham hotel room enjoying what was happening in Atlanta. What I felt was grief dressed in stillness, the specific weight of loving someone before you understood what they were capable of, and then understanding it, and having to hold both versions of them in the same chest at the same time. I had loved my son completely for 34 years. That love did not disappear at a restaurant table on a Tuesday night. It just had nowhere clean to land anymore. At 4:17 p.m., a call came from a number I didn't recognize. I let it go to voicemail. Listened to the message the moment the notification appeared. The voice was measured, professional, unhurried. The man identified himself as Reginald Fontaine. He said Mr. Reese had asked him to reach out to me directly. He left a callback number. He said the matter was time-sensitive and that Mr. Reese's preference was to speak with me before end of business. I sat with that message for a full minute before I moved. Fontaine's call told me something more important than anything Desmond's 47 attempts had communicated. Caldwell Reese had understood what my absence meant before anyone else in that building had finished reading the escrow addendum. He had not sent Fontaine to pressure me or negotiate around me. He had sent Fontaine because he knew me well enough to know that I had not disappeared. I had withdrawn. And those are entirely different things. I picked up the phone. Did not call Fontaine back yet. Called Vanessa first. She answered on the second ring. I told her about the voicemail, read her the key line. Vanessa was quiet for a moment in the way she gets quiet when she is processing something that confirms what she already suspected. Then she said, "He already knows, doesn't he?" Not a question, a conclusion. I said, "He's always known." We stayed on the phone another few minutes without saying much else. Sometimes the most important conversations are the ones where two people simply confirm to each other that they are reading the same thing correctly. By midnight, the count reached 98. I know the exact number because I had been watching. The 98th call came at 11:58 p.m. from a number I recognized immediately. Not Fontaine's office line, not the development attorney. Caldwell Reese's personal number, the one fewer than 10 people in Atlanta had. He was not routing through anyone anymore. He was calling me himself from his private line at midnight. I watched his name on the screen until the call expired, set the phone down on the sill next to the cold coffee, picked it back up, and called Fontaine. Vernette Josephine Mabry had spent 40 years being the smartest woman in every room she entered. That was not always an unfair assessment. She was sharp, prepared, and methodical in the way that women who have never been handed anything learn to be methodical. She had built a reputation in her own circles on the strength of that preparation. Years serving on redevelopment committees, neighborhood boards, and civic planning groups had taught her how to read public records, trace ownership structures, and follow the paper trail behind projects that affected communities. She researched before she moved. She confirmed before she advised. She did not walk into rooms she had not already mapped. What she had not accounted for was a room that looked fully mapped but wasn't. 8 months before the dinner, Trincia mentioned, almost in passing, that Desmond's mother had been the one to originally introduce the investor. That detail sat in Vernette's mind for 3 days before she acted on it. Then she began pulling records, public filings with the city, the development entity registered in Georgia, the operating agreement naming Desmond as principal. She was thorough in the way a woman is thorough when she believes the answer she is looking for is simply a matter of finding the right document. She found Desmond's name everywhere it needed to be. She found the project structure clean and registered. She found one thing connected to Laura Reed: the anchor parcel. Laura's name appeared in older property records connected to land that had eventually become part of the broader development footprint. Vernette noted it, looked at it, followed it as far as the available records allowed. Then she moved on. The parcel appeared inactive. No public filing connected it directly to the current operating structure. No document she could access suggested it carried decision-making authority. To Vernette, it looked like the residue of an earlier stage of the project. Important once, perhaps, but no longer central. That conclusion became the hinge everything else swung on. She told Trintia that Laura's role in the deal was historical, that she had made an introduction years ago and had been riding that introduction ever since, showing up at family events, maintaining proximity, positioning herself as relevant to a project that had long since moved past her original contribution. She told Trintia that the dinner was not cruelty, it was clarity, that removing Laura from the picture before the closing protected Desmond from a woman who would eventually want recognition that could complicate everything. Trintia believed her. She had no framework that would have allowed her not to. What Vernette never found, because it was never in any public record, because it was structured specifically to exist outside the reach of anyone conducting a standard record search, was the escrow condition addendum. A private side letter between Caldwell Reese and Laura Reed, executed at the formation of the deal, filed with nothing, held in the closing package that Reese's office controlled entirely. It was not hidden in a conspiratorial sense. It was simply private in the way that the most consequential agreements between people who trust each other are often private. No announcement, no public record. Just two people who had spent 12 years learning what the other's word was worth, putting that understanding in writing and keeping it between themselves. Vernette had spent 40 years in rooms where power announced itself, where the person with leverage made sure you knew they had it, where the most important document was always the one sitting visibly on the table. She had built her entire understanding of how these situations worked on that architecture. She had never been required to account for the possibility that the parcel she dismissed as historical was still structurally important, or that a private agreement existed beyond the reach of every search she conducted. That was the miscalculation. Not stupidity, not carelessness. The specific, practiced arrogance of a woman who had confused the absence of visible evidence with the absence of power. Those are not the same thing. Laura Reed had known that for 30 years. Vernette was learning it now. By evening, she was alone in Trintia's kitchen. Caldwell Reese called at 8:03 a.m., and I answered on the third ring. I had watched his name on my screen at midnight and let the call expire because I was not ready then. I knew what the conversation required, and I was not yet in a place where I could enter it correctly. By morning, I was. I had slept 3 hours, washed my face, made fresh coffee that I actually drank this time, and sat in the chair by the window until Birmingham's early light told me it was time to stop waiting and start moving. He did not begin with the deal. That was the first thing that confirmed what I already understood about Caldwell Reese. A smaller man would have led with the business, the timeline, the pressure his partners were applying. Reese led with, "Laura, are you all right?" Not shaped like a question, shaped like a man who had known me long enough to understand that my leaving Atlanta without a word meant something real had happened, and who believed that the real thing deserved to be acknowledged before anything else. I told him enough. Not everything. There are parts of what happened at that table that belonged to me, and I was not prepared to hand them to anyone, not even Reese. But I told him the shape of it, the dinner, Trintia, what Desmond said. He listened the way he had always listened, without filling the silence, without rushing toward a response, without performing sympathy he didn't feel. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I need you to know that what happened at that table has no bearing on what I think of you or what I have understood about this deal from the very beginning." I sat with those words. It was the first time in 36 hours that someone had said something to me that did not require me to translate it before I could use it. It meant exactly what it said. Then he told me the business reality. His equity partners had a closing window and he could not hold the structure indefinitely. If the escrow condition was not satisfied within 72 hours, he would have no choice but to suspend the current closing process and reassess the structure from the ground up. He said it plainly, without apology and without pressure. He was informing me of a fact, not issuing a warning. I heard the difference, and it steadied me. Then, he reminded me of something I had not thought about in a long time. When the project was originally being structured, his attorneys had insisted on creating several protections around the deal. Some were for financing, some were for governance, some were intended to address situations nobody expected to happen, but responsible attorneys prepare for anyway. One of those protections involved me. Not because Reese was planning to hand me something later, because the attorneys involved believed that anyone whose participation was structurally important should have clearly defined rights if circumstances changed. At the time, none of us expected those provisions to matter. The project was supposed to move forward cleanly. Life had other ideas. Then he told me about the conversation with Desmond. Several months ago, Desmond had asked Reese directly whether my involvement was still necessary. Reese had told him my involvement was foundational, not procedural, not historical, foundational. And that the question itself was the wrong one to be asking. Desmond said he understood, did not ask a follow-up, let the conversation close. Reese said he had taken that silence as comprehension. He understood now it was something else. I was quiet for a long moment after he finished. Then I asked him, when Desmond asked if I was still necessary, what did you think he was really asking? Reese paused. I thought he was asking for permission to stop worrying about it. I told him he didn't need permission and that the question was wrong. Another pause. I think now he heard that as a yes. The line held between us for a moment without either of us filling it. I reached for the hotel notepad on the nightstand, wrote 2 words, 72 hours, underlined them once, set the pen down. Then I called Vanessa. She picked up before the second ring. I said 4 words. I need Sylvester Greer's number. Vanessa did not call ahead to say she was coming. She drove 2 hours and 14 minutes from Atlanta to Birmingham. And when I opened the hotel room door, she walked straight past the threshold, sat down in the chair by the window, the one I had been living in since I arrived, set her purse on the floor, and said, "Tell me everything. No preamble, no performance of concern. Just the directness of a woman who had known me long enough to understand that what I needed was not comfort. It was witness. So I told her everything. The dinner, Vernette's dress, Trincha's rehearsed delivery, the 3 words Desmond spoke without hesitation, the folded napkin, the drive, the hotel, Fontaine's voicemail arriving at 4:17 p.m. while I sat watching calls accumulate like evidence. Reese's call at midnight from his personal line, the 72-hour window, the equity stake Reese had been holding to present at a closing table that never happened. I told her all of it in the order it occurred, without editorializing, without breaking down. Vanessa listened the way she has always listened, without rushing toward comfort, without manufacturing the appropriate expression. She just received it. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of someone searching for what to say. The quiet of someone deciding whether now was the right time for what they had been carrying. Then she said, "There's something I need to tell you. I found out 2 days ago, and I didn't know how to bring it to you until now." 3 weeks before the dinner, Trincha had called her, not to confide, to verify. Trincha had been unsettled by something her mother told her and needed a voice outside. Vernette's orbit to tell her whether she was reading the situation correctly. In that conversation, Trincha revealed that Vernette had arranged a private meeting with Desmond, without Trincha present. In that meeting, Desmond had told Vernet he was prepared to move forward without my active involvement in the closing process, that he was concerned my continued presence would complicate things. He used the word complicated. Vanessa said it carefully, watching my face as she did. I stood up, walked to the window, stood there with my back to her, and looked out at Birmingham, at the street I grew up on, at the ordinary Wednesday afternoon moving below me without any awareness of what was happening one floor up. Complicated. His own mother. The woman who called Caldwell Reese personally and put her 31 years of credibility behind her son's name. The woman who held an anchor parcel in her name for 3 years, so he would have something real beneath his feet. The woman who stepped back every time he asked her to step back, who made herself smaller every time the room required it, who protected him so completely from the weight of what she carried that he grew up believing the weight didn't exist. He sat with his wife's mother in a private conversation he did not tell his wife about, and called me a complication. When I turned around, my voice had changed. Lower. Each sentence arriving separately with space around it. He didn't humiliate me at that table. Trintia did that. Vernet designed it. But Desmond? I stopped. Started again. He sat in a room with that woman and told her his mother was something to be managed, in private, so he would never have to say it to my face. I looked at Vanessa directly. I am done being the reason he doesn't feel the weight of his own decisions. The room held that for a moment. I picked up my phone, called Sylvester Greer. He answered on the second ring. I said, Sylvester, I need to move on the parcel. Tonight, if possible. I listened, nodded once. Good. I'll send you everything in the morning. I ended the call, sat back down across from Vanessa, looked at her steadily. Now, let's talk about what comes next. Sylvester Greer called me back at 6:23 a.m. I had sent him 3 things at exactly 6 o'clock. The escrow addendum, the parcel deed, and 2 paragraphs summarizing the situation without editorializing. Greer did not need my feelings about what happened. He needed the documents and the facts in the order they occurred. I gave him that and waited. 23 minutes later, his name appeared on my screen and I answered before the first ring completed. He said, "You're in a stronger position than you probably realize." Those 10 words did more for me than anything said in the previous 3 days. Not because they were reassuring. Greer was not a man who reassured people. He was a man who assessed situations and reported what he found, which is exactly why those words landed the way they did. He was not telling me what I needed to hear. He was telling me what the documents said. Then he reminded me of something I had nearly forgotten. 3 years earlier, when the parcel had first been positioned for the development structure, Greer had reviewed portions of the documentation for a separate matter. Not the deal itself. Just enough of the underlying records to understand how the property was being held and why. That familiarity meant he was not starting from zero now. He already knew the foundation. What I had sent him that morning simply showed him where the foundation connected to the current dispute. By mid-morning, he prepared a formal protective filing on the anchor parcel, a legal instrument that prevented any transfer, any encumbrance, or any use of that property without my direct written authorization. It was not an aggressive move. It was a precise one, the difference between a woman retaliating and a woman protecting what was already hers. Clean documentation, no ambiguity, no language that could be characterized as hostile. Just the quiet, unambiguous assertion of a position that had always existed and was now formally on record. He also drafted a letter to Fontaine, professional in tone. It confirmed my legal standing relative to the escrow condition and communicated my availability to discuss a path forward, on my terms, on my timeline. Greer sent both documents to me for review at 9:47 a.m. I read them from the chair by the hotel window, approved them, signed electronically, felt something settle in my chest that I had not felt since before the dinner. Not triumph, Not relief in the way relief usually arrives, but the specific calm of a person who had moved correctly after days of holding still. There is a difference between those two things, and I understood it completely in that moment. I had not gone after anyone. I had simply stopped leaving myself unprotected. At 11 a.m., Greer called back. Desmond had retained an attorney. Young, Greer said, with the particular brevity he used when he meant to communicate more than the word itself. The attorney had already contacted Fontaine's office that morning, suggesting the escrow condition was challengeable on procedural grounds, that the side letter had not been properly incorporated into the main agreement and therefore carried no enforceable weight. Greer told me he was not concerned. The condition was airtight, the incorporation was clean, and the challenge would not survive a serious review. But he wanted me to know the move had been made. I appreciated that. Knowing what was in motion was not the same as being threatened by it. Then he mentioned something else. The right of participation provision Reese and his attorneys had discussed years earlier was still sitting exactly where it had always been in the founding documents. Nobody had removed it. Nobody had exercised it. And because the original closing had never occurred, it remained available. I had not thought about that provision in a long time. Reese's attorney mentioned it briefly when the entity was formed, almost as a contingency neither of us expected to use. The deal was always supposed to close cleanly. I had filed it in the back of my mind and left it there. It had never been exercised. It had never expired. Greer emailed the language for me to review. When it arrived, I read it once, then read it again. Then I sat back in the chair and laughed, not loudly, not triumphantly. One small, quiet laugh for the patience of a structure that had spent 3 years waiting in a document nobody expected to revisit. My phone buzzed while I was still holding the provision on my screen. Desmond, not a call, a text message. 4 words, Mama, please come home. I read it, set the phone face down on the windowsill, looked out at the Birmingham street below, the same street I had walked as a girl, the same light, the same unhurried morning moving below me without any knowledge of what it was holding up. I said nothing at all. The front desk called at 9:41 a.m. A Desmond Reed was in the lobby asking for my room number. I held the phone for a moment after the clerk finished speaking. Then I told her to send him up. I did not change what I was wearing, did not straighten the room or move the notepad on the nightstand with 72 hours written and underlined on it, did not rehearse a single word. I sat in the chair by the window and waited for the knock. He had driven the same road I drove 3 nights ago, Interstate 20 westbound. I learned that detail later, that he had left Atlanta at 7 a.m. without telling Trincia where he was going, without calling Vernette for counsel, without consulting anyone. He had simply gotten in his car in whatever he grabbed off a chair in the dark and driven toward Birmingham the way a man drives when he has run out of every other option and finally understands that the only conversation that matters is the one he has been avoiding. When I opened the door, he looked like 4 days of bad decisions wearing a tired face. The expensive suit was gone. He looked younger without it, smaller. He looked, for the first time since this all began, like my son rather than the man who had been performing confidence at a closing table. I stepped aside. He came in, sat on the edge of the bed because the chair was mine and I had not offered it. I sat back down across from him and waited. He started talking. It began as an explanation, the pressures of the deal, Vernette's counsel, how things had moved faster than he anticipated. Then it became an apology. Then it drifted into justification, which circled back into apology, which lost itself somewhere in the middle of a sentence he couldn't finish. He talked for several minutes. I let him. I did not interrupt, and I did not help him find the words he kept dropping. He had come to Birmingham to say something. I was willing to wait until he located it. When he finally stopped, I asked him one question. When Vernette asked you if I was still necessary, what did you tell her? The silence after that question was longer than any answer he could have given. He looked at the floor, then at his hands. Then he said he told Vernette he thought it was time to handle things independently, that he felt the deal had reached a stage where he could manage it without. He stopped before finishing the sentence. I said, "Without me." He didn't correct it. I said, "And did you think about what independently actually meant? What was underneath that deal before you decided you were ready to stand on it alone?" Then I told him. All of it. Reese's condition after the first meeting. The private call I never disclosed. The escrow clause. The anchor parcel sitting in my name for 3 years. Because Reese required my name on the structure before he would move a single dollar. Everything I had carried quietly so he could walk into rooms feeling like the principal. I did not raise my voice. I did not frame it as accusation. I laid it out the way you lay out a set of facts, in order, without decoration, with nothing omitted. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I didn't know." I looked at him steadily. "I know you didn't. That's the part I carry. I protected you so completely that you couldn't see what you were standing on. When someone told you to step off it, you had no way of understanding what that meant." I paused. "That is partly on me, but only partly." He sat with that, did not argue it, did not reach for a defense. I told him what moving forward required, not money, not legal arrangements yet. He needed to go home and tell Trincia the full truth. Reese's condition, the parcel, all of it. Not a version shaped for comfort, the full truth. Then he needed to call me. He stood, walked to the door, stopped with his hand on the frame and didn't turn around. "I'm sorry, Mama," I said. "I know you are, Desmond." He left. I sat back down, picked up my phone, called Greer. When he answered, I said 2 words. He came. Atlanta's professional community is not large, not the part that matters. The civic boards, the development corridors, the church networks, the quiet rooms where Black Atlanta decides what gets built and who gets trusted. That world operates on a scale that looks expansive from the outside and reveals itself as intimate the moment you need something contained. Information in that world does not travel through gossip. It travels through pattern recognition. People who have spent decades watching how situations develop learn to read a sequence of events the way a doctor reads symptoms, not by what is announced, but by what the sequence itself suggests. Within 48 hours of the failed signing, the development attorney's office updated the deal file. Greer's protective notice had been received. Fontaine's communication confirming Laura's legal standing had been logged. The file now reflected, in plain documented language, that the closing had not proceeded, and that Laura Reed's position relative to the escrow condition and the anchor parcel was active and legally protected. Every party copied on the closing correspondence received that update automatically. Vernette was copied. Her attorney was copied. The adjustment to the file said nothing accusatory. It did not need to. A legal record that places your name adjacent to a collapsed closing and a reinstated claim tells its own story to anyone who knows how to read one. 2 days after the failed signing, a board member of the Southwest Atlanta Community Development Board called a colleague, a woman who had known Laura for 11 years, to ask what she had heard about the Reed Development Project. That conversation moved to a third person by afternoon. By the time it reached its 5th, the outline was accurate in every essential detail. A woman who helped build the deal had been pushed out by her son's in-laws. The closing collapsed. The investor was reassessing the structure with Laura positioned at the center of discussions. Nobody sensationalized it. Nobody needed to. The facts were sufficient. Vernette heard the outline was circulating on the 3rd day. She made calls, reached out to 2 people she had considered reliable allies in Atlanta's civic network, women she had worked alongside on committees, sat next to at functions, exchanged favors with in the particular currency of professional goodwill. Both conversations were polite. Both were shorter than she expected. One ended with a phrase delivered in the particular register of Southern courtesy that carries no actual warmth beneath it. "I hope everything works out for y'all." Vernette had used that phrase herself enough times to understand precisely what it meant. The door was not closing. It had already closed. The story had not been started by Laura. It had not been carried by Vanessa. It had moved through attorneys, investors, consultants, and board members, not as deliberate disclosure, but as the natural consequence of a failed closing that involved multiple professional parties in a city where those parties were never more than 2 conversations apart from anyone who mattered. A private miscalculation does not remain private when it produces public consequences in a room full of witnesses. What unsettled people was not the family conflict. Atlanta had seen family conflict before. It was the growing understanding that Vernette had involved herself in a major development matter without possessing the full facts, had advised others with confidence she could not support, and had helped create a chain of events that nearly derailed a project affecting multiple stakeholders. In professional circles, bad judgment travels farther than bad intentions. 2 weeks later, the board's governance committee met to review several upcoming appointments and renewals. Vernette's term was among them. The failed development matter was not the only thing discussed. Committee members had already raised concerns over the previous year about discretion, judgment, and several situations where Vernette's confidence had exceeded the information available to her. None of those concerns alone had been decisive. The Reed matter changed that. No one mentioned the restaurant. No one discussed family matters. What they discussed instead was trust, discretion, and judgment, the qualities community boards depend on more than expertise. When the final recommendations were submitted, Vernette's name was not among those recommended for another term. No confrontation, no formal statement, just a name that was not called when names were called. Vernette called Trincia that evening. It was the first conversation between them since the collapse that did not have a strategy underneath it. Vernette said she may have underestimated the situation. Trincia, who had watched her husband dissolve across 4 days and then drive to Birmingham alone without a word to anyone, was not in a generous place. She said, "Mama, I need to know exactly what you told Desmond about Laura. All of it. Because I am starting to understand that I have been operating inside a story you wrote and handed to me and told me was the truth." She did not wait for an answer. She hung up. Then she sat in the living room of the house she shared with Desmond, picked up her phone, opened her contacts, and scrolled until she found a name. She stared at it for a long time without pressing it. The name was Laura Reed. She called at 10 p.m. I was back in Atlanta by then, had driven back 2 days after Desmond's visit, quietly, without announcement. My house was exactly as I had left it. I had walked through every room the night I returned the way you walk through a space you need to reclaim, touching nothing, just moving through it until it felt like mine again. I was sitting in my kitchen when the phone rang and her name appeared on the screen. Trincia had never called me directly, not once in 3 years of being Desmond's wife. Everything between us had always moved through him or through occasion, holidays, dinners, the managed proximity of a family that had never fully decided what it was to each other. We were never hostile. We were never close either. Most of what Trincia believed she knew about me had arrived secondhand, through Desmond, through her mother, through conversations where I was the subject but not the participant. Her name on my screen at 10 p.m. on a Thursday was its own kind of information before I even answered. I picked up, said nothing, waited. The pause before she spoke was long enough that I could hear her deciding. When her voice came, it was not the voice of the woman who had stood behind her mother at that restaurant table with a rehearsed line and a structured delivery. It was smaller than that, stripped of the architecture that performance requires. She said she wanted to meet. I asked her why. She said, "Because I need to understand what I actually did." I told her I would meet her in Atlanta the following afternoon. One condition: She came alone. No Vernette, no attorney, no Desmond. She agreed before I finished the sentence. The speed of that agreement told me more than the words did. A woman who needed her mother's counsel to feel safe would have hesitated. Trintia did not hesitate. She had already decided to come before she made the call. I chose the restaurant. Neutral ground, public enough that neither of us was cornered, quiet enough that we could speak at a normal register without managing who heard us. I arrived to find her already seated. Water in front of her, hands in her lap. She started to rise when I came through the door and I gestured for her to stay. We had enough ceremony between us already. I sat down and looked at her directly and waited for her to begin. She told me what Vernette had told her, that I had gone to Caldwell Reese privately and told him Desmond was not ready, that I had been working quietly to maintain my own centrality in the deal by undermining my son's credibility with the one man whose opinion determined everything. That the dinner, the confrontation, the line about the grandchild, all of it, had been framed to Trintia not as cruelty, but as defense. A wife protecting her husband from a mother who wanted to remain the most important person in every room he entered. Trintia had believed it. Not because she hated me, not because we had some history of conflict, because the story arrived from the person she trusted most, supported by selective facts, reinforced over months, and directed at a woman she had never truly known well enough to challenge it. She had taken that story and built her performance at that dinner table on top of it, brick by brick, without ever checking the foundation. I was quiet for a moment after she finished. Then I said, I never told Caldwell Reese my son wasn't ready. Not once. What I told that man, the one time his confidence in Desmond needed reinforcing, was that my son was ready and that he could trust him with something real. That is the only conversation I ever had with Reese about Desmond's capability. That is what I said. Trintia looked at the table. Something moved through her face that was not simple guilt. It was the specific rearrangement of a person who has just understood that the story they have been living inside was not discovered. It was constructed and handed to them by someone they trusted without question. She said quietly, My mother lied to me. Not a question. A conclusion arriving without drama. I did not confirm it. I did not need to. The truth was already sitting between us, and we both knew what it was. We sat for another few minutes. Then she said, I don't know if you can forgive what I did at that table. I don't know if I would forgive it. But I used your grandchild as a weapon. I have to live with that. She stood, left first without looking back. I ordered coffee, sat alone with it, thought about a child who had been used as an instrument before she was even born, and who would arrive in this world with no knowledge of any of it. I made a decision in that quiet, sitting alone at a restaurant table in Atlanta, about what kind of grandmother I intended to be. Not the kind anyone at that dinner table had predicted. My terms, nobody else's. Desmond told Trintia everything the morning after she called him from the living room. Not a version shaped for comfort. Not a sequence edited to protect his position. Everything. Reese's condition after the first meeting. The private call Laura never disclosed. The escrow clause. What the anchor parcel actually represented. And why Laura's name had been on it for 3 years. Trintia sat across from him and listened without speaking. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she picked up her phone and called Laura. Not to report the conversation. Not to negotiate anything. She called because hearing it from Desmond's own mouth had finally closed something that had been open and bleeding in her since the restaurant. When Laura answered, Trintia said, I understand now. That was all. Laura said, I know you do. The call lasted less than a minute. It carried more weight than most conversations carry in an hour. The 72-hour window expired that week. The closing was formally suspended. And for the next several weeks, attorneys, lenders, and equity partners did what attorneys, lenders, And equity partners always do when a structure unexpectedly collides with reality. They reviewed everything. Documents were re-examined. Positions were clarified. Assumptions that had gone unquestioned for years were tested against what the governing agreements actually said. Throughout that process, one fact never changed. The anchor parcel, held in Laura's name for 3 years, the piece of land without which the development could not be structured, remained essential to the project. Nor did the participation provision that had existed in the governing documents since formation. What had once seemed unlikely now had to be addressed directly. By the beginning of the following month, Caldwell Reese had arrived at a decision. He made 3 phone calls before 9 a.m., his lead equity partner first, then Fontaine, then Sylvester Greer. He did not make those calls to consult. He made them to instruct. The decision was not about punishment and not about loyalty. It was about structure, about aligning the project with the reality that had existed from the beginning rather than continuing under assumptions that had now proven unreliable. Laura's participation provision was formally activated. It converted her advisory position into a named equity stake with a defined percentage in the completed project. The operating structure was amended accordingly. Desmond was offered a continuing role in the project. Project manager, not principal. He could accept or decline. Greer called Laura with the revised terms later that afternoon. She read every page without rushing. Asked 3 questions about the equity percentage calculation, about the timeline for implementation, about the conditions under which her stake could be affected by project performance. All precise, none emotional. Greer answered each one without elaboration because elaboration was not what she was asking for. She signed where indicated. Desmond received the terms through his own attorney several days later. He called Laura. She answered. He asked her directly whether she had asked Reese to reduce his role. His voice was controlled, but the question had an edge. The particular edge of a man who needed to know whether what happened to him was justice or retaliation before he could decide how to carry it. She told him the truth. I asked Reese to be fair. What fair looked like was his decision. She paused. You still have a role. You still have a project. What you no longer have is a position built on a foundation you didn't understand and didn't build. Another pause. That is not punishment, Desmond. That is just what is true. He was quiet for a long time after that. Then he said he needed to think. She told him to take the time he needed. 3 days later, he instructed his attorney to accept the revised role, not with grace, not with enthusiasm, with the particular resignation of a man who had finally stopped arguing with reality and started deciding what to do inside it. That shift, quiet, private, witnessed by no one, was the first honest thing he had done in a long time. Greer called Laura after the paperwork was confirmed on both sides. The conference room on Peachtree Street looked exactly the same as it had the first time. Same table, same leather chairs, same water glasses set at each position with the quiet efficiency of a room that had no knowledge of what had happened the last time people sat inside it. The building did not know what this second attempt had cost to arrange. The room simply waited, indifferent and prepared, for whoever was coming. I arrived first. Greer beside me. We did not speak much in the elevator or in the corridor. There was nothing left to prepare, and we both understood that. I set my bag on the chair, placed my copy of the documents on the table in front of me, and looked at the room for a moment. My name was on these documents in a way it had never appeared before. Not as a condition, not as a clause embedded in a private side letter, but as a named participant. Printed clearly, taking up space it had earned. Reese arrived 8 minutes later. In person, this time. No representative. He came through the door with the unhurried ease of a man who had made his decision and was at peace with it. When he saw me, he crossed the room directly and we shook hands, the way 2 people shake hands when they have been through something real together and emerged with their regard for each other not only intact, but deepened. No performance, no speech. Just two people who had built something across 12 years and were about to formalize what it had always actually been. We sat. Greer arranged the documents in sequence. Reese's equity partners joined by video, three faces on a screen positioned at the end of the table, professional and attentive. The room held the particular quiet of people who were present for something that mattered and knew it. Desmond arrived 4 minutes before the hour. He came in without Trincia, without an attorney performing confidence on his behalf. He nodded to me when he entered. I nodded back. He took his seat across the table and placed his hands flat in front of him and looked at the documents waiting for him. He looked like a man who had made peace with something he had not chosen but had accepted. There is a specific kind of dignity available to people who accept what is true after resisting it. It does not announce itself, but it is visible to anyone paying attention. The signing took 40 minutes. Documents moved around the table in sequence. Reviewed, initialed, signed. Reese's partners confirmed their portions by video. The restructured entity was acknowledged by every signatory. My equity stake was formalized on page 7, a defined percentage, my name printed above the signature line in clean black type. Desmond's operational role was executed on page 11. The anchor parcel transfer was recorded. The escrow condition was satisfied in writing. Greer confirmed the funds release with a single nod. Then the document acknowledging my equity stake reached Desmond for his required signature. He picked up the pen, found the line, and stopped. The room did not react. Nobody shifted in their chair. Nobody looked at anyone else. The quiet simply held itself in place while Desmond sat with whatever he was sitting with. The full accumulated weight of what the page in front of him represented, what it had cost to arrive at it, what his name on that line meant about every decision that had led to this moment. He signed, slowly, with the deliberateness of a man who understood exactly what he was doing. When he looked up, he looked at me, not at Reese, not at Greer, at me. What passed between us in that moment was not forgiveness. Forgiveness requires more than a conference room and a signed page, and we both understood that without saying it. But it was acknowledgement that we were still in the same story, that the story was not finished. Reese stood when the last document was executed, moved around the table shaking hands. When he reached me, he held my hand a moment longer than the others and said quietly, "Thank you for coming back." I said, "Thank you for waiting." 12 words. 12 years underneath them. I walked out of the building into Atlanta September light and stopped on the Peachtree Street sidewalk. My city, my name on the right documents. My deal structured the way it should have been structured from the beginning. My phone buzzed. A text from Trincia. One sentence. "She's moving. Doctor says 6 weeks." I stood on that sidewalk with the afternoon sun on my face and thought about a child arriving into a world that had been through something significant before she got here. And I made a decision. One nobody who had been sitting at that dinner table on a Tuesday night would have seen coming. Desmond called at 6:47 a.m. on a Thursday in late October. I was already awake, had been sitting with coffee at my kitchen table watching the Atlanta morning arrive the way it arrives in October. Slower than summer, the light coming in at a lower angle, the city looking like it had taken a breath and was holding it. When his name appeared on my screen, I set the cup down and answered. His voice was different from every version of it I had heard across the past several months. The strategy was gone from it. The anxiety was gone. The specific weight a man carries when he knows he has done wrong and has not yet fully settled the account with himself. That was gone too. What remained was simpler and older than any of that. He said, "She's here, Mama. She's here, and she's perfect." I sat with those words for a moment, let them be exactly what they were. Then I told him I was on my way. I did not rush. That was a choice, and I was aware of making it, not as a statement, not as a withholding, but as the natural pace of a woman who had decided exactly what she was walking toward and felt no urgency about arrival, because she already knew she was going. I parked in the hospital garage, took the elevator to the third floor, walked the corridor with its particular institutional light and its particular institutional quiet, and stopped in front of the room number Desmond had texted me. I knocked once. He opened the door, stepped aside without speaking. Trincia was in the bed with a child wrapped in a white blanket held against her chest. She looked up when I came through the door. Neither of us spoke for a moment. We had already said the things that needed saying at a restaurant table weeks ago. What was in this room now did not require words as its entry point. She held the baby out toward me, both arms extending, not as a negotiation, not as a gesture calculated for effect, simply as what it was, an offering. The most significant thing she had, extended without condition. I sat on the edge of the bed and took my granddaughter. I held her the way you hold a baby when you have held babies before, with the settled confidence of a woman who knows exactly how much a new life weighs and how to distribute that weight so the child feels nothing but security. Her eyes were closed. Her face was the face of someone who had just arrived from somewhere else entirely and had not yet formed an opinion about this world. In its unfinished openness, it held every face I had ever loved. I sat with her and did not perform anything. Vernette was not in the room. I noticed and moved past the noticing without stopping on it. A week earlier, Trincia had told me she and her mother were speaking less. Not estranged, not at war. Just careful now in a way they had never been before. Some kinds of trust survive being questioned. Others survive only after being rebuilt. Whatever was happening between them belonged to them. I was not a party to it, and had no interest in becoming one today. Desmond sat in the chair across the room. He watched me hold his daughter with the expression of a man who was seeing something he understood he had almost made impossible. After a while, he said quietly, "I keep thinking about what you said in Birmingham, about protecting me so completely I couldn't see what I was standing on." He paused. "I don't want her to have that. I want her to know what things are worth from the beginning." I looked at him over the baby's head. "Then you know what you have to do differently." He nodded. It was not absolution. Neither of us treated it as one. But it was the first stone of something, laid quietly, without ceremony, in a hospital room in late October. I drove home in the afternoon. October light through the windshield, lower and softer than summer. Atlanta moving past me like a city that had been through something and come out the other side still standing. I thought about the woman who had stood behind her mother at a restaurant table and told me the best gift I could give my grandchild was to disappear forever. I thought about everything that disappeared when I did. The deal they believed was already theirs. The confidence that had no foundation beneath it. The version of my son who had once sat in a private room and called his mother a complication. All of it gone. Replaced by something that had required everything to build, but would last in the way that things last when they are built correctly. A project with my name on the right documents. A granddaughter who arrived into a family that had survived itself. A son who was beginning, one slow day at a time, to understand what things were worth. I pulled into my driveway, sat for a moment. The Atlanta evening settled around the car. Then I said it, quietly, to no one but myself and the city, and anyone who had ever been told their disappearance would be someone else's gift. She told me the best gift I could give was to disappear. She had no idea what I'd take with me when I left,